Why does violent conflict arise, and how do we then negotiate peace? Believe it or not, most people don't want to fight. War sucks for everyone, and it comes from a failure to properly negotiate. So, we're going to discuss the best ways to do that. We'll just jump right in then. So, if you would, could you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about your expertise?
Sure. I'm Dr. Molly Melin, professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Loyola University Chicago. I study international relations, and I'm mostly focused on international conflict and conflict management, as well as civil wars and other types of violence.
Okay, simple enough. So those are super big, complicated topics, and I know we're
Right.
not gonna we're not gonna solve them, but my goal is to at least understand how people even go about tackling some of these big problems, right? So I want to understand really the political framework or the global community structure in which these conflicts take place and kind of how different entities think about, managing this conflict. And then once we understand that, I want to look at some of the typical paths towards resolution, what we've seen work and what doesn't work. So I guess the first thing is like, so what are some examples of conflicts that you care about, that the international community cares about? How do we even like categorize or think about just the type of conflict that we have?
One of the ways to think about conflict is in kind of terms of typology. And so if we think of conflict as inherent between states, there are going to be things that states disagree with. Certain types of things that they disagree over are going to be more likely to lead to violence than others. And so kind of a common way to differentiate between those things is what is tangible and what is intangible. And so tangible things are like land, access to resources or control of a certain population, whereas intangible things are things like ideology, religion, ethnicity. And one of the findings that's out there is that intangible things are much harder to bargain over. They're
Really?
much harder to divide, and so they're much more likely to lead to violence. And so, if you look at examples like the Holy Land, it's holy. And so there are specific states that tie this intangible thing to what otherwise might not be a really valuable piece of land if it were just kind of looked at from a natural resource perspective or something like that. And so I think one of the reasons why we've seen this history of violence in the Middle East is this kind of intangibility that's connected to control over those regions.
Why does the international community care when conflict is happening somewhere else, either in a civil war or some fight over land that isn't their own necessarily? What's the interest? What are the stakes?
I love that you asked the question that way because that's why I went to graduate school.
Okay.
So, I mean, this puzzle I think is so interesting. So, when I was an undergraduate student, it was when NATO started getting involved in Kosovo. The breakup of Yugoslavia had been going on, and NATO was getting increasingly active in that region. And I was so curious why this was getting news coverage in the US and why it was getting so much airtime and so much interest when I knew there were lots of other civil wars that were happening out there that weren't getting that same kind of airtime and weren't getting global interest. And so I think that's kind of a puzzle that I've seen kind of my life work as trying to answer. And so why are there are cases where the levels of violence maybe aren't as horrific as what we saw in Rwanda, but at the same time you see this like vast international response. So my dissertation research was on this topic, was trying to explain kind of why we get third party interventions in the places that we do, and the nature of those interventions and kind of what those responses look like. And one of the things I found in that work is that a lot of times there's this kind of connection between the third party and the countries that are at war. So whether it's this historic connection that we see between Germany and Croatia, for example, or these trade ties are another big draw, or kind of history of alliance ties between states that tends to kind of draw states in and mean that you're interacting, the countries are already interacting on that international scale, whether it's financially or diplomatically. Those ties are going to create this engagement that, it's not always military engagement, but some kind of diplomatic engagement or other forms of attention that are kind of seeking to resolve the conflict, perhaps, or at least seeking to create some kind of preferred outcome in that conflict.
Okay, so the examples you cited are over some of the tangible things, or they're clear and violent and physical things, but obviously there's conflict of interest for many reasons, economic reasons. Does it make sense to take these apart from like the physical conflict that we care about, or all these things kind of, mesh together here, and we can't really separate the economic policies versus the military, political, geographic, all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many policies that go on in response. I have a current PhD student that I'm advising right now that's doing research on airspace closures, for
Yeah.
example. And so this is like a really common diplomatic response to one country not liking what another country is doing, right? You close your airspace to them, and it creates like travel havoc for anyone who wants to go to that region. And it actually, what she's finding, creates no change in the policy of the country that's being targeted. And so it kind of begs the question, why do countries do this, right? Like, why create economic sanctions, or why put economic sanctions on a country when the outcomes of economic sanctions are not straightforward, right? And they're not necessarily affecting the people that we want to affect, or that have the ability to influence policy in some cases. And so, a lot of times I think these actions that third party countries take are really actions that are kind of a show of doing something. And so there are things that, get news coverage. Countries can say they're reacting. It typically goes with this whole other toolbox of maybe more effective diplomatic tools and military tools that really can change the dynamic on the ground. And I think in the case of Ukraine, that's what we're seeing, right? So there are lots and lots of Western countries that have closed their airspace to Russia. That on its own is not going to change Russian foreign policy or the outcome of the war in Ukraine. But a whole lot of money and military weapons will change that dynamic, right? And so it's not necessarily changing the dynamic in terms of creating a peaceful outcome more quickly. There's research that shows that this kind of third-party engagement actually prolongs wars, but it is going to have kind of a more influence over the outcome than airspace closures or economic sanctions alone might have.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking in terms of creating conflict as well, like the economics part. Like we have sort of economic antagonism with some countries that we're not at physical war with. Does it make sense to group those together, or like is that always a worry that some antagonism will always turn to actual conflict, or is that sort of,
That
separate?
is not a worry of mine. So there's a
Okay.
really large body of research out there that shows that countries that have strong trade ties are less likely to go to war. And that's been proven like over and over again. And I think that's why I don't worry about war between the US and China, right? Like our economies are so intertwined that it's really hard to imagine that happening. So typically, kind of if we're trying to explain causes of war, we use a bargaining model to explain kind of the costs and benefits of going to
Mhm.
war. And so a lot of the kind of rational explanations of war highlight that kind of war in itself is not rational behavior. That, like, if two countries can come to some agreement beforehand, a lot of times they're going to save a whole lot of money, time, lives, and that would be kind of preferred than going to war. But the fact that they can't exactly know what the other actors' preferences are, and they can't exactly know what the other actors' abilities are, creates this challenge of information. And war kind of provides information, right? You know more about what their preferences are, you know more about what they're able to do militarily. And so it provides that information. And so looking at things that kind of prevent that from happening, that information provision, are kind of one way to think about where we might be more likely to see war. And so misperceptions about the other state, for example, increase the likelihood of war. And I think in the case of the US and China, just to continue with that example, you have a lot of communication that's happening between those two countries, right? And so that the opportunity for misperception, I think, is pretty low in that case.
I like that a lot, actually. Yeah, I guess I probably share that perspective that like war is costly and it really only happens when you fail to negotiate properly. And then a bunch of the conflicts we see are asymmetrical. Is that common? Is that more common now, or just how do we think about these sort of asymmetrical conflicts?
So by asymmetrical, do you mean it's a government fighting a non-state actor?
I suppose, yeah, I was thinking of like just one side militarily more powerful than the other in sort of a violent conflict.
Yeah, so we have seen this pretty significant increase in the number of kind of non-state actors that are involved in wars. And so kind of whether we're talking about kind of low-level rebellion that's turned violent or kind of more organized separatist movements that use kind of political means to try to get independence. And so there's been kind of an increase in these types of conflicts since the end of World War II. So decolonialism led to this kind of increase in the number of countries that are out there.
Mhm.
But a lot of those borders were created without kind of keeping in mind ethnic heritage and groups that would kind of naturally maybe live together under a single government. And so that's led to this kind of type of violence or increased number of civil wars, especially in Africa. And so I do see kind of there are some interesting trends, I think, in the types and amount of violence over time. And a lot of those spikes have happened since the end of World War II. I would recommend that you look at the Upsala Conflict Data Project. And so they put out a report every year that talks about kind of the number of armed conflicts that are ongoing in at any given year, the types of violence that are ongoing in any given year. They also collect casualty data. And so I know 2023 was the most ongoing armed conflicts in any given year since they've been collecting data, which was like, I think they started in 1948 or something like that, collecting data on this. And so we've seen actually an increase in the number of armed conflicts, but we're seeing that kind of decrease in large scale two states fighting one another wars like we saw kind of prior to the World War II era.
Both American have a U.S. bias in what conflicts we seem to care about, even though they're not necessarily here, but they involve U.S. interests. So how does the U.S. choose which ones we decide to become involved with, and then like how do other countries choose?
I guess it depends on what you mean by involved.
Yeah.
There's kind of distinctions that can be made in terms of active military intervention, where you see kind of the US sending troops, like we have done in several historic conflicts. And then there's kind of more playing the role of a mediator. So if you think of like Jimmy Carter style diplomacy, that's another way that the US has historically been actively involved as kind of a third party mediator. And I think that's a really interesting question. And so, in some cases, I guess from a realist perspective, which is kind of one of the dominant paradigms in international relations, the focus is on kind of what's the national interests and how do you decide kind of what's best for maintaining US power and US power relative to other countries globally. And so the US, you would see US involvement in other countries based on where the US sees kind of threats to power or opportunities to increase international power vis-a-vis other states. There's lots of people that don't buy the realist paradigm. And so John Mearsheimer is kind of the most well-known realist that's alive and making arguments about, why nobody should be surprised that Russia invaded Ukraine if we look at it through this kind of power perspective. And so I guess that's kind of one way to identify US engagement and strategy. I think, not all countries kind of fall into that realpolitik framework and the ways that they define their foreign policy and how they see kind of their role. I work a lot with the Swedish government, which is, I think, really interesting to look at from a foreign policy perspective, especially if you're kind of following along with their reaction to what's happening to Ukraine. And so when I was working with Sweden, I was working with their kind of Department of Peace, and they saw their foreign policy as being one of promoting international mediation and trying to follow along with what Norway does in terms of being kind of an international mediator. And that was a significant foreign policy. Now we're seeing this kind of interesting policy shift, right? Where joining NATO, concerns about security are all of a sudden much more dominant than they used to be.
Is that just because US is the hegemonic power and we can operate differently than some of these other countries, right? They can't do what we can do.
Yeah, certainly the US has different tools in its foreign policy toolbox, if you want to think about it that way, than a country like Sweden has. Sweden does have a really strong navy. And so I think that's also kind of interesting because there are opportunities there if they decided to use them. And so what was kind of in the interest of the Swedish government has shifted since, we're seeing war in Europe that could be threatening them.
Yeah. So are there any other of these sort of tools, levers of power that different countries can pull on to, influence events, even if they don't have, the US power, the global power that we are? What kind of influence does other countries have, either through international bodies or through other kinds of treaties, things like that?
There's all kinds of interesting tools out there.
Okay.
And so, there are some countries that are small and don't have kind of military might or other might, but will be willing to sell their UN vote to a good investor. So, there's really kind of interesting ways that states can become relevant, depending on what the issue at stake is. So my kind of more recent work has been looking at the role of the private sector too. And I think that's really interesting to think about, how can we expand beyond kind of traditional political actors to think more about what are these very relevant private sector actors doing that may encourage or discourage violence in the places where they're operating. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be kind of the government of a small country that's doing something, but it might be, large corporations that are either headquartered there or are doing work there that might have an influence.
So within a nation, we have overarching body of law that enforces, evenly across everyone in it, and that's sort of democratic, right? That's sort of the point of living under a democratic country, which we value, is that everyone has sort of equal power, equal part, and the law applies to everyone. Do people try to do this internationally? Is there some sort of philosophy that people adhere to where they want more or less countries have to follow the same rules and they're held to the same standards? It's a big, broad question, but that's the path I want to walk down right now.
So, I mean, certainly during the Cold War, this was a big issue, right? Where the US was trying to spread global democracy. And that was kind of what, and we could even link that to US power from the realist perspective. But that was kind of a primary foreign policy goal of the US and could explain, or was the rationale at least for US engagement in a lot of places. And so, in terms of is there a global push to spread democracy? I guess we could think about kind of who might be pushing that. And so the US, as a powerful country, might be one actor that can be pushing democracy and encouraging democracy. There are lots of different ways that the US can do that. And so whether it's through programs like USAID or offering grants or trade incentives to support democratic governments, or whether it's operating through international bodies. And so international organizations like the UN, I would say the UN does have kind of a democratic approach, and that, you know, a lot of the values that the UN was created on, the idea of peaceful conflict resolution, for example, are democratic values. And so some of the research I've done is on UN peacekeeping, and looking at how countries that contribute UN or troops to UN peacekeeping efforts get trained in ways that might promote democracy in the countries where they come from. And so the countries that are currently large troop contributing countries are not the most democratic countries, but UN peacekeeping efforts are, you know, promoting democratic values. And so is that something that helps them kind of come home and implement those values or not? I think is kind of an interesting question to see how those norms might diffuse. So I would say the UN and other international bodies do kind of espouse to promote these kind of democratic norms and democratic governance structures. That said, I was at a talk recently. Well, actually, last night I was on a panel in Indonesia where we were talking about democratic backsliding. And so there are countries that are having challenges to democracy where we're seeing democratic backsliding. But I think there are, you know, certain cultures, and there are arguments that certain cultures are maybe not as open to democratic norms as other cultures are. And so you might see more of kind of a pushback on democratic governance structures. And so I've done research in Tunisia, and Tunisia for a long time was being heralded as, you know, the success story of the Arab Spring. And so the Jasmine Revolution there was one that was nonviolent, and there was a democratic governance structure that was put in place there, and people were really, you know, talking about like this is the case that seems to be turning into kind of a long-term democratic country. And then, you know, the president threw out the constitution. And so, you know, even that case was not one that was upheld. And so I think, you know, in terms of promoting democracy in places that are historically autocratic governments, a lot of times one of the challenges is, or at least in the Tunisian case, what we see is that the challenge is economic development. And there are really strong links between economic development and democratic government. And so to the extent that countries and international bodies can help promote economic development in these places, it's a way to promote democracy in a way that is also kind of respectful of human rights and self-determination, right? It's not international, an international actor coming in and enforcing some kind of government structure on a place, but rather it's something that naturally comes from the modernization that happens when you have economic development in a place. So with economic development, you get things like education, and you want a voice in your government then. And so there's you know, kind of a long thread of research along these lines that, you know, if you start with these kind of grassroots efforts to build up local economies, to create local infrastructure, the democracy will naturally come.
Thinking as well on the next scale, not just democracy within states, but sort of between states, because right now the US is the most powerful state and we just kind of do what we want. We're not really held to a standard of, you know, in some international law very often. I mean, I know they exist, but yeah, so I guess could you talk about that a little bit, how we organize international law and how it works, if it does work? It doesn't seem to for the US, and yeah.
There are, I would say, some efforts out there. The challenge with international legal bodies is that countries have to sign on to it. And so there's been some research on the International Court of Justice as arbitrator of international conflicts. And so as a part of international arbitration, two countries would say, you know, we're having a dispute over this access to some kind of maritime space, let's say, take it to the International Court of Justice, and they would decide the outcome of that, and that outcome is binding. And the two parties agree to that beforehand. And so research shows that International Court of Justice outcomes tend to be upheld because the two parties are before the fact agreeing to the rules of the game. And so I think that's kind of one case where you see maybe more democratic style in terms of like rules and laws being engaged with. Now, the US has not signed on to that, and I don't think there are a lot of incentives for powerful countries to agree to take a dispute to third-party arbitration. But, there are countries that have agreed to it. And so to some extent, it's working. And so there is kind of some spread of those norms happening in international relations. But right now it's hard for me to envision the US ever agreeing to some kind of third party deciding the outcome of their conflicts.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That was my question exactly. Yeah. Trying to understand what might be the incentives or disincentives in joining an organization like that, especially for the US where, right
Right.
now we can do what we want. Okay. Um, so I know you do some stuff with the UN and their role in conflicts and gathering information, because that's a big part as well on just these conflicts, is just knowing what's going on, because if they're happening in a state that you don't control, then you don't control the information. So yeah, could you talk about the role of the UN, peacekeepers, how effective they are, what they do, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so there's been a huge amount of studies, quantitative studies, especially on the UN and peacekeeping over the last, I would say, like 15 years or so. And a lot of that research is showing that UN peacekeeping is really effective if they have enough troops. And so that's
Huh?
the challenge, right? And so when the UN decides to go on a peacekeeping mission, they get a mandated number of troops that they are trying to have. And typically there is a shortfall between what the number of troops are that the UN wants to have in a place and what is actually there, because countries have to voluntarily give up their soldiers to go serve as peacekeepers. And so some of the research that's been done by Meg Shannon, who's at University of Colorado on UN peacekeeping, helps explore kind of where are we more likely to see bigger shortfalls. But then she's also done work with Jake Kathman and Lisa Holtman that shows that UN peacekeeping missions, when they have enough troops, are really effective at especially protecting civilian lives. And so a major challenge for UN missions is that where they're being put in place is really different than where they used to be used. And so prior to the end of the Cold War, the UN was only used in a handful of different conflicts. They were used in places where there was a peace there to keep, is one way to think about it. And now the UN peacekeeping missions are going to places that are highly volatile and much harder to manage. And so the risk to UN peacekeepers is much greater than it used to be. And the mission is much different, right? And so because there's no peace agreement in place, it's not like they're just trying to keep two sides separate. They're typically trying to protect civilians, and
Hmm.
that's something that they're really effective at. But we have to make sure those missions have enough troops and the supplies that they need.
And then to go back to the democratic part, how democratic would you say like an organization like the UN is?
It depends on how we think about democracy in an organization, right? And so
Mm.
if we think about kind of the rules that they have in place, I would say the UN is very democratic in its structure and how it votes, at least in terms of kind of the General Assembly. But it's very much not democratic in that the five permanent members of the UN Security Council have veto power, right?
Mm.
And so this is why the UN did very little during the Cold War, because both the US and the USSR were permanent members of the UN Security Council, and they could just veto whatever the other country wanted to do, right? And so the kind of lack of UN activity during the Cold War can be explained by that veto power. If we think about the UN, the level of UN democracy in terms of kind of the countries that are sending peacekeepers and the troops that are actually acting on behalf of the UN, those tend to not be very democratic either. And so we've seen this shift that's happened over the last 15 or so years, where the countries that are contributing peacekeeping troops tend to be very undemocratic. And so they tend to come from developing nations. Bangladesh, for example, is a one of the largest peacekeeping contributor troops out there. And so if we think about kind of who are the boots on the ground on behalf of the UN, they tend to be non-democratic at this point in time. I think one way also to think about UN democracy is the fact that everybody gets a seat, right? And so every country has a representative at the UN. And so in that sense, it's a democratic institution. Their votes just don't all count the same.
Yeah, right. Okay, we'll go back to the mediators a little bit because I know you study a lot about mediators. What are the things that the people being mediated care about when they're selecting for? Why do they agree to an outside mediator? What are they looking to get from somebody else coming in and mediating their conflict, right?
That's an interesting question because mediation is so complex, right? You need the third party to agree to being a mediator, and then you also need both of the countries that are fighting to agree to who that mediator is, right?
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of research that looks at kind of where mediation happens and what are the circumstances that encourage mediation. And a lot of that work shows these kind of trajectories in mediation. There are some conflicts or crises that are kind of really attractive to third-party mediators and really
Mm.
open to mediation. And so I think in the case of Yugoslavia, there were something like 70 mediated ceasefires that happened there. I mean, none of them were upheld for more than 24 hours, but it was kind of like a hot conflict for mediation. And a lot of kind of the attractiveness of third parties to the disputants themselves depends on their relationship to that third party. There's kind of an interesting push-pull that happens here where there might be a third party that's really attractive to one side, but not attractive to another. And so there's like mediator bias that might be at play. But one of the things that we find is that these third parties that are biased when they do mediate are actually really great at getting an agreement because they have those ties with one of the sides. They're able to convince them to agree to something that they might not otherwise agree to, or maybe offer side payments or something like that.
Mm.
And the power and the profile of the mediator and its ties to one of the sides can be something that makes them an attractive mediator to one side and maybe take some convincing on the part of the other side. But then they're much more likely to help reach an agreement if they do mediate.
I see, especially if they have an interest in resolving the conflict as well.
One of the interesting trends in mediation too that we've seen is a push for more female mediators. And so increasingly we're having kind of teams of mediators, especially when it's like the Norwegians that are going on, that include women who are helping to promote kind of including terms and peace agreements that acknowledge kind of women as victims of conflict and create programming for post-conflict opportunities, whether it's payments or victims' rights or truth and reconciliation commissions that can help acknowledge some of the ways that women are more likely to be victimized during violence.
So I read that mediation generally resolves conflicts faster, and then I guess the other way you would judge it was that they're generally more lasting resolutions as well.
I would say they're more lasting when it's a biased mediator because that mediator is helping to uphold that agreement, right? And so we know when there's a third party who's like really bought into a peace agreement and is maybe helping oversee that it's implemented, then they're more lasting. Kyle Beardsley, who's a professor at Duke, has done some work that shows that generally mediated outcomes are more likely to get an agreement, but that they don't last very long because if the mediator isn't there and engaged long term, they're more likely to fail in
Okay.
the years to come.
I see. Okay, yeah, that was sort of my next question along those lines. I know a lot of people try to jump on the first, like they say, "Oh, just accept this peace deal," but like if nobody's happy, you're just going to go back to fighting really quickly. So, are there best practices for getting a peace deal, but then also, maintaining that? Are there some strategies, some general trends that we see, some best practices for doing that?
Yeah, I would say one of the trends is that having a third party who's overseeing the implementation of an agreement and helping to guarantee that agreement is a really strong finding. And so, work by Paige Fortna, who's at Columbia, as well as others, has shown that when you have this kind of third party who's helping to uphold that agreement through either threats or promises or whatever means is necessary, you're much more likely to see that being upheld. So I'm very interested in the negotiations in Colombia that ended the civil war between the government and FARC and that peace agreement. And so one of the interesting things about the Colombian case is the Colombian government actually agreed to having Notre Dame oversee their implementation of the peace agreement. And so the team at the Peace Accord Matrix at Notre Dame actually publishes reports and gives them like grades on how much of the peace accord has actually been implemented and how they're doing. And so it's not a state that's overseeing that peace agreement, although the US has certainly been involved. It's actually a university and a bunch of academics that are saying you guys are doing this well and you need to really work on, things like rural development that were also a promise in that agreement.
I see. That seems like almost an ultimate unbiased mediator there. Just
Yeah,
pure
right.
academic. Okay. I found a quote from one of your papers, and it said, "Peace does not rest on the shoulders of a single peacemaker, and nor does violence." So this is kind of a broad question, but like when you're negotiating peace, you have leaders that are negotiating, but it has to be accepted by the countries, the population. There's all sorts of competing political powers within countries. In the US, if the president is something, most things still have to be approved by Congress. So I was just wondering, like, how that works in terms of political systems. I saw that there's not a big difference between negotiations between democratic and authoritarian countries. Just the underlying power structures are kind of the same in upholding this. I don't know. I don't know how to think about this. It's kind of a broad question.
One way to think about it, and I guess for this question, I'm more thinking about civil wars and conflict within or violence within a state. And so thinking about it's not just kind of the leaders of a violent movement that have to implement any peace agreement. And so a lot of times in civil wars, we see kind of the leaders of a rebel group who will agree to a peace deal. They'll get some kind of, amnesty or sweet position in the new government or whatever.
Yeah.
And then kind of the rank and file members are left to kind of deal with the shambles of rebuilding a life that isn't necessarily one that's you know built on their skill set, especially when we're looking at like second generation rebels who were born into rebel camps and possibly illiterate and don't have kind of transferable skills necessarily at the ready to engage in legal commerce. And so I've gotten really interested in kind of what is the nature of that transition process like at the local level. There are some peace agreements that have this kind of formal demobilization program that helps people to reintegrate from rebel life. They may have things like in the Colombian case, there was actually like a cash payment to all of the former FARC members that was seed money for starting your new life. Also, a lot of times there are kind of housing camps for these former rebels to help them kind of transition to legal lifestyle. And so looking at kind of how do you get that buy-in from kind of rank and file members is really complicated depending on what kind of programs are implemented in the peace process. And so some of the ongoing research that I have with a Colombian scholar, Santiago Sosa, and a postdoc who's at St. Andrews right now, Alyssa D'Amico, looks at kind of the nature of peace agreements and how is it that kind of what's written in that peace agreement, is it providing kind of public goods like economic development and kind of these like shiny things that might buy off kind of a general public, or is it including private goods that would help kind of in the short term ensure these people who were carrying guns and trying to kill people lay down their guns and find a job that's legal? And so that kind of short term incentive that these kind of private goods for ex-combatants is really necessary to create peace, and ensure a peace agreement is upheld and that there aren't kind of spoiler groups that spin off where we have kind of renewed violence. I think another way to think about it, and the book I'm working on right now is right along the lines of this topic, so there's a lot that I could say about it, is kind of how do you create these contacts between different groups that were fighting before. And so how do you create this kind of opportunity for interaction and socialization so that individuals stop seeing other individuals as the other, if you will? And so some of the research I've done in Northern Ireland on private community organizations looks at how these community organizations that have been created are often created along sectarian lines. And so they're actually encouraging more violence because you're only interacting with people that are, part of your side, if you will. And so it's actually creating more divisions among society instead of creating peace. And so creating opportunities for people to interact with the other is one way that you can create this kind of long-term peace and ensure that there's kind of implementation, and also creates circumstances that prevent violence, as well as crime. And so oftentimes there's kind of a spike in crime that goes along with a peace accord because criminalization of things that were once considered part of a war is common.
Yeah, so you're trying to change some culture through political means as well, and kind of using that.
Exactly.
I'm going to shift to the corporate influences here because I know you write a lot about that. The term I saw was that it raises the cost of violence if you have thriving businesses in an area.
So my last book, The Building and Breaking of Peace, looks at corporations in the context of civil wars and kind of the things they can do to help raise the cost of violence, and things they can do to create violence as well or prolong violence. And one of the things that I found in that research is you have this kind of shift in corporate culture that's happened over the last 20 years, where corporations are increasingly under the microscope in terms of kind of the way they operate day to day, right? Like it's very easy to raise a flag if there's corporate wrongdoing. And so businesses are starting to think more about this kind of promoting stability in the places where they're operating, as well as thinking about implications of stability for their bottom line, right? It's costly for a company if there's ongoing violence, or if violence breaks out in a place where they can't easily divest from. And so one of the things I found is that companies have the ability to be kind of neutral proponents of peace, and that can be really important. So prior to the end of the Civil War in Northern Ireland, the US government passed what's known as the McBride Principles. And that was that any US corporation that was operating in Northern Ireland had to engage in fair hiring practices. Prior to the McBride Principles, there was a lot of bias in hiring. Northern Ireland has this kind of long history where, certain factories were Catholic, certain factories were Protestant, and, you couldn't get hired, based on kind of your, where you stood in that conflict. And so
I'm laughing because it seems silly now, but yeah, that's
yeah,
it's a big source of
it's not a
conflict.
conflict that's about religion. It's a conflict
Yeah.
that's about colonialism. But it is along these kind of sectarian lines, right? And
Yeah.
so US companies were engaged in the same unfair hiring practices, and then this was passed. And that kind of led to a push by the private sector that was headquartered in Northern Ireland to also think about kind of what are the peace dividends that companies could have if there were peace. And so during the Troubles, the private sector was heavily targeted because corporations were seen as, part of the United Kingdom's power. And so the IRA frequently targeted private companies, whether they were large corporations or small businesses. The business sector was, part of the ruling power. And so the consortium of business and initiatives actually published a paper saying, if we can end this violence, the Northern Ireland economy is going to take off. And so they really promoted the dialogues that led to the Good Friday Agreement, but they promoted negotiations that were towards a peace deal and not a specific peace deal, which I think is really interesting. So they never lobbied for the Good Friday Agreement. They just wanted a peace, not a specific peace. And we can contrast that with in Colombia, where the private sector had representatives at the negotiation table in La Habana. And the private sector there was really interested in the terms of the agreement, most notably making sure that they weren't held accountable for some of the behavior that they'd engaged in during the warfare there. And so they actually prolonged the violence and made it, they promoted, they were part of the No campaign in the vote that took place in 2016 because they didn't want to be held accountable. And so this is, making the negotiations more complicated because the private sector is a veto player in that situation instead of just promoting peace. And so it's, it depends on how they act in terms of kind of what their influence is over peace and violence.
And that's the form their influence is through lobbying, through public perception, through, yeah, sort of they
Yeah,
have
and
money to
adopting fair
spend. And
hiring practices, right? Like if you're
I
if
see.
you're hiring in a fair way, you're going to create these interactions among diverse groups, right? In kind of a safe space, right? You're going to enable people to interact with the other in ways that they might not otherwise interact, and that can be really influential in terms of kind of the social reintegration that needs to take place after an agreement.
Mhm. And then how about internationally? Do we think about international corporations as well in international markets? So obviously, when there's a big conflict, changes markets, sanctions, all these things that corporations tend to lose money if they're selling to one state or another. But then also, of course, we've seen them influence states to promote violence and things if they have their own interests that are, in another country. I'm thinking like banana republics are a famous example of they have their own interest in another country and they're using state power or lobbying state power in order to fulfill their interests and causing conflict. So how do we think about that for corporations in terms of international?
Yeah, so I wrote a op-ed for War on the Rocks a few years ago when war in Ukraine first broke out, because what I saw happening in that case was so many corporations were taking a stance on the conflict and were pulling out, right, of Russia. And the argument I made in that is that that's the wrong way to approach it. Corporations should stay invested, that it was a way to create this kind of informal diplomacy with Russia, and that the private sector can be this kind of proponent of peace, kind of much in the way that the McBride principles help to promote the idea of peace dividends, that having kind of US informal engagement through private investors is one way to help create norms of peaceful conflict resolution in a place where kind of isolating them could actually backfire. I think that's kind of an ideal situation where you have corporations that are behaving well and promoting peaceful resolution. I think the other challenge to pulling out is that a lot of times that is going to harm kind of the regular people, right? And so it's not Putin who's hurting from corporations pulling out so much as it's, people who were employed there, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and
so
that ties along with the sanctions. So not just corporations making that decision, but the government's making that same decision, right? It doesn't
certainly,
just the
yeah,
same
yeah.
thing.
So
Yeah.
it's hurting these kind of, people who were working for American companies. And, if you think about kind of the role that soft power plays in that form as well, it can be really helpful to, even help democratize a state, if done well. That is not to say that corporate actors are always good and always
Mhm.
behaving well. I mean, I think 2 weeks ago, the US court came out with a ruling on the Chiquita case in Colombia, where Chiquita is now going to be paying the families of the victims of paramilitaries that they hired a lot of money. And it's this kind of groundbreaking case that's, I think, really interesting, that shows that corporations can be held accountable for behaving poorly, and being kind of bad actors in the international system, and can, hopefully prevent this type of thing from happening again in the future.
I haven't heard about that. So what's the like enforcement mechanism there? What's the governing body
There's a
that's doing
US
that?
court that
I
decided
see.
it out of Florida. I can't remember which circuit it is, but yeah, I mean, Chiquita, if they want to be continuing to do business in the US, they're gonna have to pay this fine.
I see. Okay. Interesting. Are there ways that through government we can force corporations to be a little more promoting of peace rather than self-interested? Are there laws that people think about making that kind of help this process along versus just, the pure self-interest of corporations?
Well, I think the McBride principles, once again, are a really great
Something like that.
example of that. So that was a US law. They required any kind of US business that was operating in Northern Ireland to adopt to engage in fair hiring practices. And so that's a good
Mhm.
example of the way kind of the legal system can help prevent violence or help encourage peace. I think the Chiquita case is another example where US courts can, help promote engaging in ethical behavior abroad.
Okay, I just have a few more kind of, they may feel a little more speculative questions here, but just
Okay.
a little things to go back and tie up. So we talk about back to like the China and US and that we're so economically tied. Do you think it's a good idea to promote states' interconnectivity, interdependence economically to promote peace? So certainly, like objectively, when they're more interconnected, they are. But then at the same time, if you're more dependent on another country, you lose some power in conflicts as well. So like as an individual nation, should we be trying to connect more or should we be trying to be more self-reliant?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at the push-pull that's present, right? If you're importing all your goods, you use control over the quality of those goods, for example, and the conditions under which those goods are made, right? If you're worried about environmental issues or human rights, or other kind of types of things that can be, under the radar, if you're not controlling the goods that you're purchasing, that can be, a concern, certainly. But at the same time, we know that countries that trade with one another are much less likely to go to war with one another. And so that, to that extent, this globalization can be kind of a peacemaker in itself. So I know, like, Russia and Ukraine are still trading with one another, which I think
I
is
was
so
gonna bring that up.
interesting,
This
right?
doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, Russia still needs its wheat, right?
Yeah,
And so, to some extent, I think that is an important way that you can create peaceful interaction. And even when countries are still at war, that they're able to trade with one another. I think that those meaningful interactions, there's the potential for them to grow as
I
well.
see. Hmm. You brought up at the beginning that there's more conflict this past year than ever before. Is that part of the noise? Is there a general trend of less violence, or is it just kind of random always?
Yeah, there's a trend that's actually more violence, and I'll send you this report so you can put it in the show notes too, from so UCDP UPSLA Conflict Data Program just published their 2023 data that shows that there's 59 ongoing armed conflicts in the world. It's the most ongoing armed conflicts that they've recorded since like 1948, 1949, or something like that. There is kind of an upward trend from the last few years, starting in 2020. A lot of the casualties have been in Ethiopia and the Tigray region. That conflict ended, I believe, in 2022. And so kind of the number of casualties has gone down. And certainly kind of overall, since the end of World War II, we're seeing this kind of trend in the shifting nature of violence that we talked about, where you have not more non-state actors engaged in violence, but kind of the number of ongoing conflicts has certainly grown in the last few years, and we are seeing this kind of upward trend.
Okay, so people aren't crazy for thinking that the world's becoming more violent.
Yeah.
Before that, though, was it good or just sort of, you know?
Yeah, so they actually they have an interesting graph in the report that shows kind of violence over time. And so a lot of the violence spiked in 2020. Prior to that, there was a dip in the amount of violence. And so we've seen spikes due to Sudan, Israel, Myanmar. And so these kind of ongoing
I see.
long-running conflicts are causing that increase over the last few years.
Okay, so it's really just cultural things that shift and sort of independent of broader things.
Yeah.
So, so are there any like technological changes or political changes that you see having a large impact on the number of conflicts, the type of conflicts that we see, things like that?
There are people that kind of talk about the different types of war and kind of generations of warfare as having
Mm,
changed. And so scholars of military history talk about, for a long time you would see like two militaries line up on a battlefield and then like charge at each other, right? And we don't really
mhm.
see that anymore, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of a change in military technology that's happened. And another change that happened was like Germany created the Blitzkrieg tactic, where they would go in and like kill all the people that they could and then get back out. These kind of lightning wars is what it translated as. And so there are some kind of technologies that enable different types of fighting. Drone warfare is one that people talk about a lot now, and how, that you don't have to have somebody physically present to kill other people, right? Is this huge technology shift. I don't know that that necessarily changes the amount or types of war that we're seeing. It just changes kind of the way that war is being engaged. I mean, the same thing with nuclear weapons, right?
That's where I was
It's
going. Yeah.
did mutually assured destruction was seen as the big pacifier during the Cold War, right? The US and Russia, or USSR, never engaged in direct military combat, was largely due to this kind of idea that they would explode the entire earth, multiple times over with all the nuclear arsenal that they had both created. But it wasn't really a peaceful time, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
just because the US and Russia, or the US and USSR, were not directly engaged in combat, there were a lot of proxy wars going on where they were arming other people and killing other people. And so I don't really buy this idea that technology is shifting and the nature of war is shifting. In the end, it's about how do we get political leaders to communicate with one another, and to provide information and communicate in a way that is going to enable peaceful negotiations.
Okay. Yeah, that feels right to me. Okay. And
Mhm.
then what do you think are the important questions or topics that people in your field should be investigating, are investigating?
Oh, there's so much cool research going on right now. I think one of the interesting trends in international relations research is that we're increasingly looking at more localized data. And so in civil war states, we observe that there can be locations in a country that are like really, really violent and dangerous to be in. And then there's other sections of the country that are not violent, or not experiencing that same type of violence. And so to say that a country is at war is
Mhm.
maybe a misnomer. And so the trend to collect more geospatial data that gets at localized concepts of peace and violence, I think is really interesting. And so the challenge with that is, while we have really fine-grained data on where victims of violence are, we don't have really fine-grained data on the explanations of violence. And so if we want to explain kind of, why people are being killed in a certain region and not in others, we don't know, information about, how well the government is functioning in that region and what's the rule of law in that region and kind of what is the nature of the private sector in that region. And so having access to more explanatory variables that are localized, I think would really push that research forward in important ways. I'm really interested in the role of the private sector and thinking about how kind of a non-traditional political actors have influence over political outcomes. And so I'd like to see more research that's taking into consideration the role of corporations as well as small businesses and how they can contribute to peace and violence as well.
Okay, so I come from more of a science engineering background, and quantification is the name of the game here. And you're talking about a lot of variables here. It seems overwhelming. So is there quantification efforts to look at these variables, or is it more qualitative still, or you're working
No,
on?
so I would say political science really shifted starting in the 80s and is largely heavily quantitative, especially in the studies of conflicts. I would say, now we're seeing kind of a trend where people are trying to, incorporate both qualitative and quantitative types of research, but a lot of the research in kind of peace and conflict studies has been, large data, looking at kind of trends in violence, looking at, increasingly sophisticated statistical technique and trying to use those tools that are available to explore kind of what are the predictors of violence.
I see. So when you're talking about getting all these local variables and stuff like that, you're confident you can develop the tools to analyze them then and get into the, okay, I like that. Good.
Yeah, it's fun.
Okay. Good. That's all my questions. Do you have anything else to add? Anything else you'd like to promote?
No, thanks for having me, Matt. This was a really interesting conversation. It's always nice to talk to people that are not in my field and just, hear about kind of what other people think are interesting.
That was my goal, having people like you on.